A little while ago, more precisely in the year 1988, my dad went out to a camera store and bought himself this camera. Additionally, he also bought a 100 to 300mm zoom lens. The reason for this purchase was a trip he had planned and was about to embark on, a trip to Zimbabwe, where he expected to go on safari and see a bunch of animals. As far as I have heard from his stories, it was a wild trip with a lot of fun experiences, so fun that he now, over 30 years later, thought he ought to show this part of the world to his kids. And so, in 2019, he began researching and planning a trip to the neighbouring country Botswana with my brother and sister, me, and maybe some others who'd want to join. He had it all figured out, and we were set to visit Botswana in spring of 2020. But you can guess why that didn't happen. A year passed, and the trip was still scheduled for this year, but again, it had to be postponed. And then, finally, this year in spring, things weren't looking too bad. About a week before the trip, nothing had yet been cancelled, and we were realising that this travel plan was about to become real. And it worked out. We actually managed to get to Botswana and experience 10 days of exploration over there. Not without a bunch of complications, but that's a story for another time. For this trip, I had brought with me a film camera with a couple rolls of 35mm film, my Olympus XA3 with a roll of black and white film, and my Lumix GX80 with two lenses. The 20mm and the 14 to 140mm lens, which I intended to use for an attempt at wildlife photography, seeing as its maximum focal length is a full frame equivalent of 280mm. Of course, before the trip I had no idea what to expect, but I was hoping to see an elephant or two which I could neatly photograph with the gear I had brought. Turns out we didn't only see an elephant or two, but actually a bunch of animals, really a lot of animals. Even the elephants were a lot, so many that we stopped counting on our first day already. This therefore gave me the opportunity to approach my attempt at wildlife photography in a more relaxed manner, because I still wanted to focus mostly on the experience and leave the photography in the background, but with this many animals it wasn't so hard to get a good balance of both. And so, over the course of the trip, I gathered quite a lot of photographs, some of which I have compiled in a slideshow which I would like to present to you in this video. So, I've selected a bunch of varying types of photographs, some just for the sake of varying animals because I wanted to show you the different kind of animals that we saw. Also, my favourite shots are of course in this little collection, and also I included some that were not so good, just the variations of kind of shots that didn't really work out and where I thought we could talk about why they didn't work. First of all, I wanted to start off with this photo, which I think is a nice mix between an environmental photo and the wildlife photography, seeing as the photo is not really focused on one specific animal, but it's just on this little pack of impalas is what these are called, these antelopes. And this is one of the photos that I like, and I thought this would be a really nice introductory photo, because this introduces not only the animals that we saw, but also the environment that we were exploring, because I don't know how many of you have been to Botswana, but before I went I had no idea what the place actually looks like. Also, I didn't do much research. I wanted it to be really more like a surprise for me as well. And so as we got there, I was surprised how green it was, but turns out that was because we were there in April, and April is just past the rainy season. And in the rainy season, everything gets their portion of water in the year, and now, from now on, in the next couple months, everything is going to get drier and drier and dry out until everything is really brown and the next rainy season comes. And so this is at the very beginning of the drying season, and therefore everything is still really green and blossoming. And these beautiful animals called impalas were just, I don't know, feeding here, I suppose. Those in the middle actually are looking at me, wondering if I'm going to come closer or not, which feel like the subject of the photograph, whereas the others are more like side characters. And then we've also got the beautiful environment of this grass in the foreground, and then the forest in the background, and the white clouds in the top half of the photo. It's a rather simple composition, I'd say, but I think it's a really nice introduction to this series. Then let's continue with two photos of elephants. This was maybe even on the first day of exploration, so these might be the first elephants that we saw. And I included both of these photos here for a little comparison, you could say, because I really like the left photo and not really the right photo. And so I thought, yeah, it'd be cool just to compare these because they're rather similar. So the left picture is, in my personal opinion, the one that really worked out nicely. We've got a similar situation like with the impalas, that we've got multiple elephants and just one or a couple elephants in the middle are clearly the subject. In this case, it's this one elephant that is looking at me. And then we've got three other elephants that are just part of the image, but not really actual subjects, I suppose. The two things that I'd like to point out here, which I really like in the photograph that make it work, because you have to know, For me at least, I was trying out wildlife photography for the first time, and I found it really hard to do what I usually do, which is carefully pick a composition and stuff like that, because in this situation I was mostly shooting out of the car. So the first dependency that I had was of course my position, which often was dependent on where my dad stopped the car. Of course, when I was driving, I didn't really photograph anyway, but probably I was sitting at the back here and my dad just stopped and I had to hope that it was more or less a good position for me. In this case, I think it worked out beautifully, but what I like here is that we've got this grass in the foreground that even covers the elephant a bit, so that it seems like it's hiding behind the grass, which just gives this photograph some wonderful depth so that you can actually feel the space that we were in. And also the trees in the background add to the layering in the photos, enhancing this feeling of three-dimensionality in a two-dimensional photograph. And the second point that I really appreciate how it worked out here is the lighting. And that's the one thing that separates the two photos in my opinion. Here we've got some sunlight and the elephant luckily was just turning its head so that the light hits half of its face, whereas the other half of the elephant's face goes into the shadow and you have this nice contrasting light, which in my opinion just adds interest, because I think flat light is quite boring. So I mean, you can't, it's the wrong perspective now, but if I look directly at the light, just the light is completely flat in my face and I have no shadows, whereas sitting like this, I've got a little bit of shadow here. And that's what I got with the elephant here. Of course, it was pure luck because the elephant happened to look that way and I happened to press the shutter at that moment. So yeah, that's what I really like about this photo. And in the other photograph, which I wanted to show as an example of a photo that just didn't really work out, I believe this was the second elephant that we saw, and we actually got out of the car to just hide behind some bushes and just look at it from the distance. As you can see in the foreground, we've got these bushes, which I think is again a nice element to add some depth to the photo. But as you can see, the lighting, it's just not there. I think the sun at that moment was just being covered by a cloud, and so the whole photo is basically a shadow, and so you can barely really see the structure of the elephant, whereas in the other one you can actually see how the skin looks like because it's being lit up by the sunlight, and you get harsh highlights and shadows, which often doesn't have a pleasing look. But in this case, I think especially with the skin of elephants, which is quite special, it just really enhances the amount of detail that you can see. And so in this right photo, I think the lighting situation is the main problem. Also, the composition is just not as interesting, but apart from the composition, I think the lighting is the big problem because everything's just flat and there's no real depth added by any light. So yeah, that's why I wanted to include this photo as a negative example. Then I would like to continue with two shots that I would probably count to one of my favorites from the trip. These are quite different, as you can see from what I just showed you. This was sometime later in the trip when we were in a different area already, and as you can see, the environment was quite different. There were no trees. None. I mean, of course there were some trees, but in these frames there are really just no trees. So the situation that we were in is that there was this track going through this national park that just we as people can drive on, and the environment was this very wide, vast landscape of fields and grass and a couple trees here and there, a couple bushes, but as you can see it's mostly just grass, and that's all you can see. As far as your eye can see, there's just grass and fields and some animals. And so in the left photo you can see quite clearly in the foreground there were some, I think, water holes is what you actually call it in Botswana, because these are just holes of water that then dry out over the summer. And these water holes, of course, attract a lot of animals because they want to drink some water. And so we were driving past this water hole and saw some zebras and this, what is it called? A wildebeest, I think, is what you call that animal on the left. And at the very right, you can see there's just that one elephant alone in the distance, having a good time walking around. And I thought it was really such a fun, different type of composition, because this composition actually feels quite two-dimensional, but I think here it feels like it was done on purpose. It has this very different compositional structure, meaning that you've got this one line and above you've got some clouds, and then you've got the pond at the bottom, and in the middle you've got this piece of grass where, as if somebody had just selected some animals and just put them there. I can't think of a name how you call these kind of photos. Basically, it's a photo that is really made up of shapes, because sometimes you have photos that have a lot of shapes, and sometimes, like the previous photo of the elephant, I wouldn't say that was a photo that had a lot of shapes. It was all just this one scene and some blurry grasses in the foreground and then that elephant. But here you've got more recognizable shapes and layers. it all seems like it was stacked on top of each other. And similarly, the right photo, it's very minimalistic. It's just this one line at the bottom with the elephant crossing it, and above is the sky with the clouds. By the way, the clouds in Botswana are amazing. I am not used to having such beautiful puffy clouds. Here in Austria, I have to say, the clouds are quite boring. I didn't really know that clouds could be so different depending on where in the world you are, but I found out that in Botswana, they have these huge puffy clouds just flying around every day. It was sunny every day, but we had these huge clouds just passing by all the time, whereas here you either have pure sun or pure cloudiness. But here you get this beautiful mixed weather where you have the blue sky, but a bunch of white clouds just hovering around above you. And so I often liked to include the sky as an important part of the image, and so this is one example. And I'm not sure, I think I missed focus or something. It just looks sort of blurry, but I really like it for some reason. It just really adds something abstract to it. I'm not exactly sure what happened, but somehow it just doesn't look quite sharp, but that's what makes it more interesting for me, because this photo doesn't need to be sharp, because as said, what I'm trying to convey here are the shapes, and the shapes are clearly visible, so I think maybe it even helps the photo that it's slightly blurry. Anyway, these are two of my favorite photos, but let's continue on the next slide, where I've got two photos that I wanted to show, but they're not really my favorites in any way. This is the same giraffe, I believe. We were driving past this giraffe and just went by very slowly so that we could get some photos of the giraffe. And the left photo I wanted to show you as another example of a photo that didn't work, and the right photo is then the version that did work, even though I don't think it's really special, but I wanted to include it because I wanted to show you the giraffes. So the right photo is more or less a simple portrait of the giraffe, which, by the way, I love that it is looking at me again. It's like it was posing for me. It was like this, and then, oh hi, photograph me. It really feels like that. And I also love that the lighting is coming from the side again and playing with the shadow. And so I think it actually worked out quite nicely. I'm just not quite sure about the framing. That I had to cut off its legs is a bit strange, maybe. But at the same time, I didn't really have the possibility to include the whole giraffe in a nice way, because as you can see, then that happens what happened on the left side. And my main issue was this tree in the foreground that really has a distinct shape that just doesn't go well in this composition with the giraffe, and that's why I wanted to include it, because I think without that tree, it would work. I think, because the giraffe perfectly comes into this free space with the head. You see how the head, behind the head, there's just clouds, there's no trees. It wouldn't be messy if only that tree weren't there. But that's the situation that I was in. I was just sitting in the car, and I was dependent on where my dad would stop the car to see what framing I could get. And this is the best I got. Then on this next slide, I've just got one photo, and that is because I really like it. This is also on the very top of one of my favorite photos from the trip. This animal is called a kudu, I believe. And as you can see, this was from the car again. You can see in the right corner, there's a little bit of blurry blackness. I suppose that was the edge of the window or something. I just really love the composition, how it worked out here, because again, we've got these shapes and layers just piling up on each other. So we've got the foreground, the grass, then we've got the kudu with some bushes, and then above the kudu is just this huge mass of clouds, and that's these beautiful clouds of Botswana that I was speaking of. I mean, just look at that. They are huge and just beautiful, gorgeous clouds. But what I love is that it doesn't end with the clouds, but actually above the clouds there's another section, another part of the photograph that is just the blue sky. And so we've got these beautiful shapes just stacking up on each other again, which, I don't know, it just creates a really interesting image in my opinion, a really interesting composition. And the kudu is this one thing that holds everything together as the subject of the photograph. I think without the kudu it would be a bit boring, but the kudu is like the anchor and the point of interest, and the rest is the environment. And the beautiful thing that is when the subject works and the environment itself is interesting as well, then you get a nice photo that just works in total, I suppose. Also, another just coincidence that really worked out is that I happened to find the kudu in this position where there's that tree right behind the kudu on the left side of the image, and also this leftover of a tree on the right side of the kudu, on the right side of the image, and the kudu is just right in between there in the middle, which again just enhances the flow of the framing because nothing interferes with each other, which is I think the main problem with the photos that didn't work out. It's just varying elements that interfere, whereas here everything just sits nicely. It's a photo that I'm really happy with. Then here is an example of a photo that I personally think didn't work out at all. So we were just driving past a couple zebras, and of course I thought, oh, I'd love to get a photo of these zebras, because I mean, I knew that zebras exist, but as I saw them, I just realized how crazy cool these animals are. I mean, look at this white and black pattern. How on earth is this a natural phenomenon? How did nature actually just think, oh, you know what, let's make these horse-like animals but with stripes? And I mean, look at that head. I don't know if you can relate to what I'm saying here, but it was, for me at least, a really fascinating moment to actually see zebras in real life and to see these beautiful stripes that they've got. And so, of course, I tried to photograph a lot of them, but here, as you can see, the photo, it's this thing that I was talking about with the elements interfering. First of all, the angle is a bit strange because you've just got a bunch of greenery in the background, but no real separation of shapes. You can't really see where the horizon is. Everything is just a bit blurry and somehow. And then there's that one zebra, which is clearly the subject, but you've also got these zebras that are just peeking into the photograph on the right. And so the composition just feels like it's not really structured in any way. It's just not a composition, it's just a quick snapshot of the zebra. Then, what would a trip to Botswana be without seeing the king of the animal kingdom? Of course, we were hoping to see some lions, and we got to see 3 of them. Here are the 2 photos that I think worked out of the lions that we found. It was actually really funny. We just left our accommodation, our campsite, and we're driving about a minute or so, and suddenly, just next to the path, these lions were just lying around. They were just lying there and they didn't feel bothered at all from us. They knew exactly that they are the kings. We just drove past them slowly, looking at them, getting some photos, and they just looked at us like, what are you guys doing here? They weren't bothered at all. On the left side, I got this more environmental photograph with the whole environment included, with the sky, the trees in the background, and the field in the foreground. And then out of the field, peeking are the 2 lions that were sitting there. And also the lighting worked out. It was not so early in the morning anymore, but still we had a little bit of morning light. And so the light was coming like from the top side, basically. And so it was really cool to see these animals in real life, and I'm happy that I got a couple photos, 2 of which are these, and I think these really worked out nicely. Okay, so let's move on to the next photo. This photo might be my absolute favorite photo of the whole trip. It's this here. So you can probably already think why I just love this photograph. It looks like it's straight out of a cartoon, and these 3 animals are friends and are about to walk on to their next adventure or something. I'm not sure if you can actually see the 3 animals because it took me a while to actually see the 3rd. We've got the warthog on the left, the elephant in the middle, and then right at the foot of the elephant, there's, much smaller than the elephant, a white duck or a goose or something. I'm not exactly sure what kind of a bird it is, but that white bird there. The photograph itself, like in aspects of lighting and stuff, isn't really so special. I do really like the composition though. Again, we've got this very vast landscape far into the distance, but in the foreground we've then got these 3 characters of the photo, and there's not really much to say about it. I think it's very obvious why I love this photo. It just feels so funny almost, because these animals suddenly feel like they have so much more personality. I just love, for example, that the elephant has its foot up because you can really see the motion of it walking that way. Also that the warthog, if you look at the warthog's front legs, they are perfectly in this walking motion. And then the duck that is just leaning in front, as if it was charging in front to follow up with its 2 big friends. I really can't pick out anything else about this photo except that the subjects here just work perfectly. Then let's continue with some birds. In this photo series so far, I haven't really included any birds except for in the last photo, the little white one. But of course, Botswana has a huge variety of beautiful birds. and I didn't really photograph many, seeing as birds are quite hard to photograph since they move so quickly. So this was just in the middle of our trip, just another evening, and it was a beautiful sunset, and we were hanging out at this river to watch the sunset, and I noticed these birds flying around sometimes. Every few minutes a couple birds would just fly above me in this beautiful formation, and so I thought it'd be cool to capture the colors of the sunset with some of these birds. That photo is really dark, as you can see, but I really like how the birds are now these beautiful silhouettes and clearly visible. And the thing I wanted to capture here is this formation, and I think I luckily got to frame them quite nicely in more or less the middle of the photo with the clouds in the background. Then let's continue with these two photographs, both of which I actually wouldn't count to my favorites, but I do really like them. So the left photo is a little family of warthogs, which I thought was really cute. We met these warthogs somewhere and actually stopped the car here, so this is now not shot from the car, but we actually got out of the car and just walked a couple steps and hid behind a bush so that I could get a photo from a lower angle, because from the car you have more of a higher angle, which for these warthogs I think I didn't really like, and so I wanted to get a bit lower. So yeah, zoomed in at 140mm again and tried to capture them from the distance, and I think the composition worked out quite nicely. Again, we've got these layers, and I love that they are looking this way. They're all just looking at the camera, and I think it's a nice family portrait of them. And then on the right, I got a photo of this baby elephant. We didn't really see many baby elephants, and so that's why I wanted to get this photo, because I thought it was so cute. It's probably the smallest elephant that I saw on this trip. And well, first of all, I didn't really know how small baby elephants can be. And also I didn't know that elephants actually lie down like that, and I don't know how elephants sleep, and so it was really interesting to see this baby elephant just lying cuddled up in itself on the ground with its family around it to protect it. So I think this is quite a cool photo, because you can see 3 elephants around that baby sort of protecting it or just being around it. Photographically speaking, it's really not a special photo. The lighting is quite strange because the baby is all in the shade, and then the foreground is so bright because it was sunny. So it's not really a good lighting situation, but I wanted to include it because in this photograph I think just the context itself and the subject is what really caught me here. Then let's continue with 2 more photos of elephants. As said, we saw a lot of elephants, and so I got a lot of chances to photograph elephants in different ways. And so these 2 photos are just 2 different ways how I got to photograph an elephant. So on the left, this elephant didn't feel bothered and just came closer, looked at us, and then walked on. And this is the moment just before it decided to walk on, just as it was turning away. And so I really like how the pose of this elephant here is quite dynamic and special in that sense. It's not just standing and eating or just standing around. It's more of an interesting pose in the sense that it's moving, it's got its legs not all straight, and its trunk is doing this movement. And so that's what I like about this photo, is that the subject here is just a different variation of what we saw so far. And the right photo is a detail photo, as you can see, of the elephant's eyes, but also of the skin, because as you know, elephants have very special skin. As far as I'm informed, it's very thick and very robust, and it's really interesting the kind of skin that they have. So I thought it'd be great to get a detail photo. And what better part of the elephant to photograph to see the skin more carefully than its face? And so I got this photo of its eye, and I think the photo is, photographically speaking, nothing outstanding or special. Like, the composition is very simple, the lighting works out. I think, again, this photo really just works thanks to the subject, because we've got this nice close-up of the elephant, and the elephant is what is so interesting in the photograph, not the photographic aspect itself. So it's time to show you the last photo of this series of my attempt of wildlife photography. Here, this is, well, more of an environmental landscape photography, I suppose, but including some wildlife. This was one of the very few times that we actually saw vultures, which, by the way, are absolutely terrifying animals in my opinion. They don't look so bad here, but we saw some actually spread their wings and just fly, and these things are huge. They're just birds, but they are huge. I think if they spread their wings, they are probably about as big as my arm length. At least the ones that I saw looked absolutely huge. And here, this is, I think, a very typical scene of vultures just being on a tree and looking around if there's anything that they can eat. I think it's a very classic scene that you would see. And so I kept the framing quite wide, so I included a lot of the clouds in the sky again, and then the foreground with that tree that just connects the two, the bottom and the top. with the vultures on top, I think this is then what makes the photograph interesting, because I think the tree alone would just not be interesting enough. And so I think this is a really nice photo that just worked out quite nicely. But there's not much more I can say about it. So yeah, I guess that's the end of this series. And so yeah, this was my attempt at wildlife photography. I don't really know how you define wildlife photography, and of course you can clearly see that this is just my attempt of doing wildlife photography on the side a little bit, but it's not really comparable with good wildlife photography. You can see that this was not a dedicated wildlife trip, but I think considering that I was just in the car having a good time on the trip and on the side just sometimes shooting a little bit, I think I really got some decent shots. As said, my favorite is that cartoon-like shot of the three animals walking together. Anyway, I'm really curious what you think of these photos. I personally find a lot of photos here that I like a lot, and so yeah, I wanted to show them to you. As usual, I'm curious about what you think about these photos. Leave it in the comments, I'd appreciate it. And that's it for this week. I hope you enjoyed it, I hope you had a good time, and I'll see you again next week in the next video. Until then, goodbye.